A 900-ton steel fortress vanishes in a blizzard at minus 60 degrees. 2 days later, it returns, unmanned and drifting through solid ice. How did the Baychimo survive 38 years without a crew? You are standing on a slab of fractured pack ice, 70 degrees north, where the wind doesn't just blow, it screams. There is a scent in the air, a metallic tang of ancient rust mixed with the sterile bite of frost. Before you sits the Baychimo, a 1,900-ton steel ghost, listing heavily to the port side. Its funnels are cold, choked with a thick layer of rime ice that looks like gray wool. There are no footprints in the snow, no voices on the bridge, just the rhythmic, metallic groan of a hull that should have been crushed decades ago. In July 1931, Captain Sidney Cornwell stood on the sun-drenched docks of Vancouver, overseeing the loading of $1 million cargo. This wasn't a journey of discovery. It was a cold-blooded commercial race for the Hudson'S Bay Company to extract thousands of silver fox pelts. They had 18 months of rations and a Swedish-built hull they believed was indestructible against the flows. But by October 1st, the temperature plummeted to minus 60 degrees, and the Beaufort Sea began to thicken into a viscous, grinding trap that no amount of steam-driven ambition could break. The critical failure wasn't just the weather. It was a tactical blunder born of corporate arrogance and a late departure. They ignored the unusual blue tint of the new ice, a warning sign of extreme density, pushing the Baychimo 10 days past the safe navigation window. By mid-October, the vessel was paralyzed, 45 miles from the nearest shelter, its rudder jammed by jagged pressure ridges. The crew built primitive shacks on the ice, watching as the massive steel plates began to gasp and buckle under a pressure that sounded like uninterrupted artillery fire. On November 24th, a blizzard obliterated the horizon for 3 days, and when the air finally cleared, the site was empty. The captain assumed the Baychimo had finally succumbed to the depths, yet days later, the ship was sighted drifting calmly, miles away, completely unmanned. How does a massive steel steamer, crippled and locked in a frozen vice, suddenly liberate itself and begin a 38-year journey without a soul on board? The logbook ends in a frantic scrawl, but the physical evidence suggests the ship didn't just survive, it changed. The Baychimo wasn't just a ship, it was a 900-ton statement of corporate arrogance. In July 1931, as she cleared the Vancouver harbor, she looked less like a vessel and more like a floating vault. The air smelled of fresh paint, coal smoke, and the heavy, sweet scent of luxury supplies. Captain Cornwell stood on the bridge, his hand steady on the brass telegraph, steering 30 men into a seasonal window that was already slamming shut. Visual anchor, a wide-angle shot of the black hull reflecting in the calm, emerald waters of the harbor. The Hudson'S Bay Company didn't invest in exploration. They invested in certainty. The Baychimo was their pride, a Swedish-built steel fortress designed to punch through the Arctic's white skin like a hot needle through wax. They carried enough rations to feed a small village for 18 months. Every rivet, every steel plate, every bag of coal whispered the same lie. That nature could be bought and managed for a profit. Visual anchor. Close-up of a silver fox pelt being tossed onto a massive, towering stack of cargo in the hold. They crossed the threshold of the Bering Strait with the engines humming a steady, rhythmic song of triumph. For a few weeks, they were kings of the North, navigating a maze of sapphire blue leads that seemed to open just for them. The men spent their evenings playing cards and drinking coffee, oblivious to the fact that the barometer was beginning to shudder. Clyde's tone. They thought they were the masters of the map. They were just guests who stayed too late. Visual anchor. A handheld lantern illuminating a group of sailors laughing over a card game. But the Arctic doesn't play by corporate rules. It waits for the first sign of weakness. By the time they reached Victoria Island, the sludge ice was already forming, a viscous gray soup that clung to the propeller like wet cement. The temperature began its slow, agonizing crawl toward the basement. You can see it in the early log entries. The handwriting is still crisp, but the margins are filled with notes about the tightening grip of the pack. Visual anchor. Macro shot of a heavy brass thermometer showing the mercury plunging toward the 0 mark. Cornwell had a choice: turn back with a partial load or push deeper for the full $1 million payout. He chose the latter, betting the lives of 30 men against a Swedish hull and a fading summer sun. It was the moment they left civilization behind and walked into the white. They didn't know they were transitioning from a commercial voyage into a forensic case file. Visual anchor. A lone, dark silhouette of the ship against a vast, featureless horizon of gray ice and purple sky. The logistics were perfect on paper, but the ice doesn't read paper. As the sun dipped lower, the leads began to vanish, replaced by a horizon of jagged pressure ridges that looked like the teeth of a giant. The Baychimo was no longer a fortress. She was a target. The crew started to notice a new sound, the high-pitched metallic scream of the hull resisting the first true squeeze of the winter. Visual anchor. A tight shot of a single steel rivet under immense pressure, steam venting from a nearby pipe. The Arctic has a way of letting you think you're in control, right up until it decides to swallow you. By September 1931, the air didn't just turn cold, it turned malicious. The Baychimo began to struggle as the viscous sludge ice thickened around her Swedish steel. You can almost hear the strain in the boiler room as the coal-fired engines fought against a sea that was turning into concrete. The iron fortress was starting to feel like a very small, very cold cage. Visual anchor. A close-up of the ship's iron hull being scraped by jagged, crystalline ice needles. Captain Cornwell's log entries grew shorter, more clipped, as if he were trying to save ink for a winter that wouldn't end. The first major gear failure wasn't the engine, but the rudder. A stray chunk of blue ice, hard as granite, jammed the mechanism. The ship became a 3,000-ton sled, drifting at the mercy of the Beaufort current. The crew's confidence began to fade as they realized they were no longer navigators, but passengers. Visual anchor. Look at the shaky handwriting in this log entry detailing the jammed rudder. The hollow hunger hadn't set in yet, but the rations were already being guarded like gold. The temperature plummeted to -40, turning the interior of the ship into a humid, frost-covered tomb. Condensation from 30 breathing men froze against the bulkheads in thick, jagged sheets. Every time the wind shifted, the hull groaned, a sound like a giant's teeth grinding together. They were 300 miles from civilization, and the exit was freezing shut. Visual anchor. A macro shot of frost crystals growing over a brass door handle inside the crew's quarters. In early October, the ice performed its first squeeze. This wasn't a collision. It was isostatic pressure, a slow, relentless crushing force that made the steel plates gasp. Rivets began to pop like pistol shots, echoing through the empty cargo holds. Cornwell made the call to establish Camp Baychimo on the ice floe, half a mile from the ship. They were abandoning the safety of the hull for wooden shacks and canvas tents. Visual anchor. A wide shot of the tiny flickering lights of the ice camp dwarfed by the dark, silent ship. The strategic blunder was now unavoidable. They had waited too long to offload the $1 million cargo, and now it was trapped in a deteriorating vault. The men sat in their shacks, listening to the rhythmic scream of the wind, smelling the faint scent of kerosene and damp wool. They were waiting for a spring thaw that was months away, unaware that the ice had its own plans for their vessel. The tension was no longer about the journey. It was about survival. Visual anchor. A weathered, frozen Hudson'S Bay blanket draped over a crate of supplies in the snow. The most haunting part of the forensic record is the silence between the storm cycles. During these lulls, the men could hear the ship talking, the metallic moans of a structure under terminal stress. They were living on a moving puzzle of ice, and the pieces were starting to shift. If the floe cracked beneath their shacks, they would be lost to the dark stains of the freezing water in seconds. The white grinder was just getting started. The visual anchor. A low-angle shot of a deep, dark crack opening in the ice near a tent peg. This is where the law of man ends and the ice takes over. By November 24th, 1931, the Arctic decided it was finished playing with the Baychimo. A blizzard slammed into the camp with 70-mile-per-hour winds, turning the world into a featureless, screaming void. The men huddled in their shacks, feeling the ice vibrate with a rhythmic, sickening thud. They were trapped in a white silence, waiting for a ship that was no longer breathing. Visual anchor. A grainy photo of a wooden ice shack nearly buried under a massive, wind-sculpted snowdrift. When the sky finally cleared, the horizon had been rewritten. The spot where the 900-ton steamer had been moored was an empty, jagged scar of blue ice. Captain Cornwell climbed a pressure ridge, his lungs burning in the -60-degree air, looking for a funnel or a mast. There was nothing. The ship had simply vanished into the dark, taking with it the million-dollar cargo and their only hope of a warm voyage home. Visual anchor. A wide, desolate shot of an empty ice lead where the ship's dark hull used to sit. They assumed she had foundered, her steel skin finally surrendering to the isostatic pressure. But 2 days later, an Inuit hunter brought a report that defied every law of maritime logic. The Baychimo was seen 45 miles away, riding high in the water, drifting like a ghost through the pack. The ship hadn't sunk. It had escaped. Cornwell tracked it down, finding the hull battered but afloat, a deteriorating shell that looked more like a predator than a vessel. Visual anchor. A tilted horizon line seen through the cracked lens of a ship's sextant. This was the moment of the fatal betrayal. Looking at the mangled rudder and the buckled plates, the captain made a choice that would haunt him for 38 years. He declared the vessel a total loss and ordered the remaining crew to be airlifted out, leaving the Baychimo to its fate. They left the engines cold and the lanterns dark, abandoned to the shifting currents of the Beaufort Sea. It was a tactical surrender to a foe that wouldn't let go. Visual anchor. The final telegram message typed on a weathered ribbon. Vessel abandoned. All hands safe. But the lost cargo had other ideas. As the planes disappeared into the clouds, the Baychimo began its true journey, a life without a master. It was seen again in 1932, then 1933, a rust-streaked specter haunting the Alaskan coast. Every time a salvage crew got close, the ice would shift, or a storm would brew, as if the ship itself was protecting its million-dollar secrets. Clyde's tone. The ice didn't kill it. It claimed it as a trophy. Visual anchor. A heavy, rusted iron mooring cleat on the deck, coated in a thick, crystalline glaze of rime ice. The ordeal for the men was over, but the psychological stain remained. They had walked away from a fortress that refused to die, leaving $1 million in silver fox pelts to rot in a deep-freeze vault. The forensic records show no mechanical reason for the ship to stay upright, yet it drifted over 1,000 miles. It was a phantom betrayal. A ship that was supposed to be a tomb, but chose to be a wanderer instead. Visual anchor. A discarded, half-frozen navigation chart flapping in the wind on the abandoned bridge. The snow covers the mistakes, but the journals don't lie. For 38 years, the Baychimo was a legend that refused to settle at the bottom of the sea. It became a masterless object, a 1,000-mile wanderer of the Arctic shelf. The forensic verdict isn't found in a single wreck site, but in the decades of sightings that followed. From 1931 to 1969, she was the silent sentinel of the North. Visual anchor. A weathered black and white map of the Alaskan coast, with numerous red dots marking sightings over 4 decades. The science of her survival is a cold irony. We built her to defy the ice, but it was the ice that kept her afloat. By squeezing the hull upward, the pack created a natural cradle, preventing the buckled plates from taking on the lethal weight of the sea. The ship was preserved in a perpetual deep freeze, her cargo of silver fox pelts becoming faded artifacts in a deteriorating vault. Nature didn't destroy her. It adopted her. Visual anchor. A detailed cross-section diagram showing how pack ice pressure can lift a ship's hull out of the water. Look at the final sighting in 1969. An Inuit group spotted her stuck in the pack ice of the Chukchi Sea, a rust-streaked specter in the twilight. There was no smoke, no movement, just the persistent silhouette of a 19th century ambition that wouldn't sink. When the investigators returned a year later, the site was empty once more. She had slipped back into the fog, perhaps finally surrendering her $1 million debt to the silt. Visual anchor. A grainy long-distance telephoto shot of a ship's funnel disappearing into a thick wall of Arctic fog. The real cost of error wasn't just the 30,000 pounds or the $1 million cargo. It was the hubris of the Hudson'S Bay Company, believing a Swedish hull could ignore the unusual blue tint of the frost. We call it technical debt, the price paid for every ignored warning and every late departure. The Baychimo remains the ultimate case study in Arctic vulnerability. The records are closed, but the mystery remains open. Visual anchor. The official corporate seal of the Hudson'S Bay Company stamped onto a dusty, closed file folder. Clyde's tone. The journals don't lie, but they don't tell the whole story either. We found the camp, we found the logs, but we never found the frozen figures of the cargo. They are still out there, somewhere beneath the shelf, resting in a steel tomb that outlived its creators. Survival isn't about the gear you carry. It's about knowing when the environment has revoked your permit to exist. The ice always gets its due. Visual anchor. A slow underwater pan over a field of rusted rivets and twisted steel beams on the dark ocean floor. The legacy of the Baychimo changed the maritime law of the North forever. It forced a mandatory end-of-season cutoff that no commercial interest could override. It proved that in a fight between $1 million profit and 1 billion tons of ice, the ice remains undefeated. Captain Cornwell lived the rest of his days haunted by a ship that wouldn't stay sunken. He learned the hardest lesson of the dark survival niche. Some things are better left to the white silence. Visual anchor. A final shot of a lone brass lantern flickering out as the screen fades to a cold, clinical black.